Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 best legendaries to craft in Hearthstone right now in the middle of the Kobolds and Catacombs meta. Now, that doesn't just mean that these are Kobolds cards. In fact, these are cards from all of standard format, and these are the 10 legendaries I think are going to be the best for your collection on average. Now, there are two ways to craft: people who want to build a good collection and people who want to build a specific deck. This is not a guide for crafting for a specific deck. Of course, in those instances, you can just look up the deck and craft the cards you need that you don't have. This is more about building a well-rounded collection. And on that note, I did weight cards here by how long they were going to be left in standard format. And because, of course, we're pretty close to a standard format rotation at the moment, that does mean some pretty strong and powerful cards were actually left off of this list, and I felt like it would be a disservice not to mention those. So right here we have essentially 4 cards, which I think would have made this list if we weren't about to rotate them out of standard format in just a couple months' time. And those cards are Aya Blackpaw, Nazoth the Corruptor, Kazakis, and Yashiraj, each of which are being played pretty prominently right now. If you're really desperate for good cards and good decks like today or over the next 2 months, or if you're okay to invest in wild format a little bit, all 4 of these cards are going to be fantastic additions to your collection. But in good conscience, I couldn't quite put them on the list just because I know they're leaving standard format so soon. It's also worth mentioning that, of course, 10 cards is a pretty arbitrary number. Makes for a good title on a YouTube video, but it doesn't really mean much in the scheme of a good collection. So I also wanted to do sort of a honorable mentions set of cards. So here I have a few extra cards I thought were deserving of some degree of attention, but maybe weren't quite fitting for the top 10. And those are Malfurion, the Death Knight for Druid. We've got Alex Straza, a card that doesn't see a ton of play right now, but historically has been really, really good in Hearthstone. Tyrion Forge Ring, another one of those cards that's not being played right now in Paladin all that much, but is just such a darn strong card that you know it's going to come back. You know it's going to see play in a different meta in a different time, so it's a good piece for your collection. You've also got Lyra the Sun Shard, a card that Priest really likes to run, and of course Priest right now is a fantastic class. And then finally, Rexar, another good Death Knight for Hunter. Hunter is not necessarily popular at the moment today, but Rexar is one of those cards that looks good enough and just universally strong that it's going to be a good fit for your collection. Now, when I considered which cards are actually going to make this list, there are a few different variables I weighed here that I kind of balanced together to see which cards I thought were most deserving. And those are essentially the impact or the power of the card, just how good is it, how much is adding that single card into a deck or into your collection going to make it that much better. So high impact, high power cards can be more influential, can give you bigger chances to win games. On top of that, I had the resiliency of the card weight. Now that essentially means how likely is this card to be good in different metas and in different environments and different contexts. If it's hyper reliant on something else, maybe it's not going to be that good of a fit for your collection. And also just things like how much is it played right now, today? What's the relevance of it today? Because that's pretty influential. You need this card to matter right now, not just necessarily in the future. So essentially by balancing out all of those different aspects of a card, you can start to get a feel for just how good it's going to be on average. Now, all that said, this is pretty subjective. It's just my opinion and my take on things and my read on Hearthstone, which I think is pretty good. But of course, as with any decision, you should certainly seek out a second opinion. You should look at somebody else's list. You should talk to the community at large, because that's how you're going to get the best opinion on crafting cards. Now, all of that said, quite a bit of preface to this video, but now let's finally jump into my actual top 10 legendaries to craft. Starting off at the number 10 spot here, we have Ysera. Now this one might surprise some people because Ysera isn't a card that sees a ton of play right now. In fact, it's pretty rare outside of things like Big Priest or the occasional inclusion in like a big Dragon Druid deck, neither of which are all that prominent today in the meta. But Ysera is one of those foundational cards that's just a part of the classic set, so it's going to be around forever. It's also a neutral legendary, so you can use it across a variety of different classes, and it just tends to show up from time to time in control archetypes. So it's essentially something that's really good to have around. And although it might not be as impactful as a card like Malfurion, which was on my honorable mentions list, in the meta today, right now, Ysera is such a good piece to have in your collection. She's going to be able to find a home from time to time in different decks across the eras and across different metas and expansions and rotations, that Ysera deserves a spot on this list on top of some of those other cards. Moving on to the number 9 spot here, we have Rogues, Edwin Van Cleef. Now, this is a card that, although a class card, is just so fundamental to Rogue's success that it has still earned a spot on this top 10. Edwin Van Cleef is basically in every version of Rogue that's ever been played. Miracle Rogue, of course, can utilize Edwin Van Cleef in some pretty surprising ways. And even Tempo Rogue, one of the very best decks in Hearthstone over the last few months, over the last 2 expansions, really also finds a home for Edwin Van Cleef. And since he's such a high-impact card in very prominent and popular decks, not to mention that he's a part of the classic set as well, so he's always going to be around. As long as you're ever planning to play Rogue, Edwin Van Cleef is going to become a really powerful piece in your collection, and that's why he takes the number 9 spot. Up next at the number 8 spot here, we have Priest's Shadow Reaper Anduin. And I don't think I need to tell you just how good Shadow Reaper Anduin is in Hearthstone today. Of course, in combination with Raza the Chained in the Highlander-style Priest deck, he's absolutely dominating the ladder. He is everywhere, and it feels like one of the most oppressive and powerful decks in Hearthstone's history. So you shouldn't be surprised to see Shadow Reaper Anduin here in the context of today's Kobolds and Catacombs meta. But even beyond that, some people might say, oh, but Shadow Reaper Anduin's going to be terrible once Raza the Chained rotates out of standard format. And I do agree that that's going to limit the impact of Shadow Reaper Anduin over the long term. But despite that, Shadow Reaper Anduin is still played in non-Raza decks like Big Priest. And because of that, he's so good today, just so dominant today, that's worth quite a bit. But the fact that he's still likely to be somewhat relevant in the future as well, just because that battle cry is so strong, and frankly, just the standard default hero power isn't too bad either. It's clearly not as good as a zero-cost version, but actually still has a lot of utility. When you combine all that together, Shadow Reaper Anduin still has some lifespan left in the post-Raza standard format, not to mention, of course, this could be a dominant card in Wild for the foreseeable future of Hearthstone. All that adds up to a card that is a pretty smart craft to this day, even if you're worried about that standard format swap in a few months' time. So now we'll move on to the number 7 spot with the Lich King. And this is a card very much like Ysera. It's just one of those neutral, legendary bomb-style cards that so many different decks can just slot it in, and you suddenly have a great piece of the puzzle in your deck that offers you just some guaranteed value. And Lich King is really even better than Ysera in a lot of ways, and that's why he's higher on this list. Even though he's not a classic card and he won't last you forever, there's still a lot of life left in the Lich King in standard format, and he's a higher impact card that can be played in even more decks. Even mid-range and sometimes even aggro decks have slotted in the Lich King at the very top of their curve just to give them that last final big bomb that your opponent can't answer. Ysera is much slower than Lich King in a lot of ways because she doesn't have taunt and she doesn't have nearly as aggressive a stat line, that 8 attack versus 4 attack, for instance. So she doesn't ever find a home in those aggro decks as the top end piece, whereas Lich King does. And because of that additional flexibility, and frankly the fact that his Deathline hero cards are often stronger than Ysera's, all that means Lich King is a better craft and takes a higher spot on this list. It's a good piece for anybody's collection. Moving on to the number 6 spot here, we have Paladin Sunkeeper Tarim, the 6-mana 3/7 here that has been a staple in Paladin ever since his release in Journey to Unguro. Sunkeeper works in really hyper-aggressive decks like Aggro Paladin, right now the best deck in Hearthstone at the moment, but he also works in control decks. He can remove big stuff and neutralize big Jades. He can set up your tiny board of things to kill your opponent. He's one of the most flexible and I would argue well-designed cards in Hearthstone's history, and he's an incredibly high impact play anytime you play him. So given his consistency, his flexibility across archetypes, and just how good he is when he actually hits the board, he can swing games in enormous ways. That's why I ranked a card like Sunkeeper Tarim higher than something like Edwin Van Cleef, despite the fact that Edwin is a classic card and this one is eventually going to rotate out. I think Sunkeeper Tarim is just more relevant right now, and often a more high impact card than Edwin, although Edwin can be high impact. Sunkeeper is far more consistent in that high impact. So a card that's very deserving of this spot, one of the best legendaries ever as far as design is concerned, and maybe just one of the best legendaries ever as far as power level is concerned as well. You just can't go wrong with Sunkeeper Tarim as long as you're ever planning to play Paladin. So now let's move on to the last of the class cards on this list, and as I mentioned before, I am giving neutral cards a much higher preference in their craftability just because you can use them across so many different classes. But Blood Reaver Gul'dan here is going to be our last class card, and Blood Reaver Gul'dan right now is just an incredibly good card in every sense of the word. Anytime you play Gul'dan, it's a game-ending, game-winning kind of play. There are very few decks or matchups that can survive Gul'dan hitting the board. And Q block right now in particular, you can play a million different Void Lords or Doom Guards, a game-ending kind of play. But even in Zoo Warlock, a much more aggressive version of the class, Blood Reaver Gul'dan still finds a home and a ton of success in a deck that is very aggressive. And anytime a 10-mana card can make the cut in an aggro deck like that, you know you've got a good card in your hand. There's basically no version of Warlock right now that isn't running Blood Reaver Gul'dan outside of some silly stuff, but two of the better decks in the meta right now, Zoo and Q-Block, both run this card. He is just so good at what Warlock wants to do and synergizes so well with Warlock, and his hero power is so strong. His battle cry is so swingy. He's probably the strongest class legendary in the game right now, and since he's being played a ton, he's incredibly consistent and, of course, just so darn good when he's played. That is why Blood Reaver Gul'dan to me is actually the best class card to craft in Hearthstone right now. And now we'll move into the top 4. We've got just neutral cards remaining, and at the number 4 spot here we have Knights of the Frozen Throne's Prince Keleseth. And this guy, although not quite as popular in the Kobolds and Catacombs meta as he was near the end of the Knights of the Frozen Throne meta, is still seen all over the ladder. One of the most popular cards in Hearthstone, despite the fact that his condition is so difficult to meet still to this day, not playing 2-cost cards. He's so strong and so good when you do activate that battle cry that a lot of decks are finding ways to make that sacrifice and make Prince Keleseth work. Now, most famously, this card is played in Tempo Rogue in combination with things like Shadow Steps to get a crazy amount of buffs onto the board, but basically every class at some point now has found a way to make Prince Keleseth work, and I don't think that's going to change fundamentally over the course of his lifespan in Standard format. It looks like people are still going to be able to do that. This is still going to be a viable way to play. Now, with the rotation of Patches the Pirate, I do think Prince Keleseth gets a little worse just because you can't get that instant infusion of his buff stats onto the board, but of course that changes everything in the Hearthstone meta. But I think Prince Keleseth will survive, and it looks like one of those cards that's just going to be a key neutral card to build decks around and an influential piece of the meta for the next year and a half or so, and that's why Prince Keleseth is so darn high on this list. And as we move into the top 3 here, this one might surprise a little bit given my spiel at the beginning of the video regarding rotating cards. Patches the Pirate is the only card that's going to be rotating out in the next few months that made the cut on my list. And that is because really Patches the Pirate is absolutely the best card to craft in Hearthstone. He's everywhere. His power level is off the charts, even though he just looks like a meager 1-mana 1/1. You can't underestimate the power of getting those stats onto the board for free, particularly in the Corridor Creeper meta. Patches the Pirate gets even better in combination with that particular card from Kobolds and Catacombs. So Patches, if you're just trying to build the best deck today or the best collection today, right now, this is your number 1 card. The only reason Patches is not in the number 1 spot on this list is because I do know that he's going to rotate out of Standard format in 2 months. So I had to dock him a little bit. Still made the top 10. He's still one of the best cards to craft right now. But if you are looking to build a good collection for the long term, you might have to pass on Patches. If you just want to have a good Hearthstone collection over the next few months, Patches is going to be worth it. He's strong enough. He's good enough. It's going to be hard to play Hearthstone for the next 2 or 3 months without Patches the Pirate. So still a good craft for now. Still sensible. Still worth it. Of course, just weigh the upsides and the downsides and the risks of a card rotating out, and then you'll find whether or not Patches is worth it for you. But to me, you just can't go wrong crafting this guy still. Even with his short lifespan, Patches the Pirate is almost the best card in Hearthstone to craft. So now let's move into the top 2. Up first we have Blood Mage Thalnos. Now this is a card so many people look at and they say, why on earth do I need to craft Blood Mage Thalnos? That card is just a 1/1. What does it do, Regis? Why is it important for my collection? And I admit that this doesn't seem like the most high-impact card. It's certainly not the kind of card that when you play it, it feels like it wins you the game, or that it's that influential or that swingy, or that it's bringing an otherwise budget collection up to some new level. I'm not sure it does that, but Blood Mage Thalnos is just one of the most consistent and efficient cards in Hearthstone. There's so much packed into this tiny little guy. You can use him in a Death Rattle style deck as card draw. You can use him for spell damage too, and a lot of different decks have done that. He fits in just so many different puzzles, and that's why so many different decks in Hearthstone historically have been able to run Blood Mage Thalnos. Now, he might not feel like the very best card at the moment today, and in fact, there aren't very many decks playing him right now, but I guarantee you, as meta shift, as everything rotates, as things move around, as new decks come into play, Blood Mage Thalnos is going to be one of those cards that shows up time and time again. You're going to be playing him. If you're concerned for giving yourself a game-winning card, maybe Blood Mage Thalnos should be a little farther down on the list. But when it comes to consistency and efficiency and cards that you know you're going to be playing over and over again, he is just fundamentally one of the most iconic and playable legendaries in the game. But there's one last card I think is more craftable than even Blood Mage Thalnos. Outside of things like Sylvanas and Ragnaros, which used to always top these lists, unfortunately those were moved to the Hall of Fame. So now it's just Leroy Jenkins left at the top of the list. Leroy is the very best legendary card to craft in the entire game, and that's because, of course, Leroy is the go-to finisher for so many different kinds of decks. He is the best and most efficient charging minion for his cost. This gives you the maximum amount of damage for cost in a mid-range card like this, so it's perfect to top out those aggro lists as the final card in the list that just gives you the ability to seal the deal. Right now, he's played in a handful of different decks, probably most prominently in Tempo Rogue, because he interacts really well with Shadow Step in that list, but there are lots of other aggro decks like Face Hunter or even Aggro Paladin that can slot in a Leroy Jenkins and give them also that damage they're looking for to end the game. And because of that, Leroy Jenkins is a great card to have around. He's even played in more control decks historically too with combos. I mean, you used to see him with things like Power Overwhelming, for instance. Now that's not in standard format anymore, but those kinds of turns, combo decks utilizing Leroy Jenkins, will still exist in the future. So even if you say, oh, Regis, I'm not an aggro player, I only play control, or I want crazy combo shenanigans, Leroy Jenkins might still be the card for you. He can still see play. He's probably the safest card to craft out of anything else on this list because he's a neutral card. So many different decks play him. He's a part of the classic set, and he gives you a high-impact, game-winning, game-finishing sort of play. So Leroy Jenkins pretty much checks off all the boxes for the criteria I mentioned at the beginning of the list for reasons cards will make this list, making him indisputably, to me, the very best card to craft. I don't even think it's close. Nothing else is remotely as good as Leroy or as safe to craft as Leroy. Nothing else is going to increase the value of your collection quite like this card, unless maybe Sylvanas or Ragnaros are dragged back into standard format. Then Leroy Jenkins stands alone at the top, the very best legendary card to craft. And there you have it, folks. That is my list, the 10 best legendary cards to craft in Hearthstone. Now, I know anytime I make a list like this, there are all kinds of people who come out of the woodwork and say, oh, Regis, you got it all wrong. This card's better, or this card didn't deserve the list. Why did you put this in this order? Listen, I want to hear those comments. Please leave those in the comments below. And if you're watching this video, everybody commenting below is a great second opinion. Don't just take my word for it. As I mentioned, listen to what the community has to say, take in other people's opinions, and then make your crafting decisions. And I guarantee you there's going to be a lot of great dissenting opinions in the comments below. So read all of that, decide what's best, and go from there. Don't just take my word for it when it comes to crafting. I did the research, I put in the thought, I think that this is the best list, and on average, these cards are going to give you the most bang for your buck when it comes to your arcane dust. But I'm not perfect, and I get things wrong, so please leave comments and read comments below. Tell me what's wrong, tell me what's right, tell me the best legendary cards to craft in Hearthstone right now, and I certainly will read it, and so will lots of other people. But until then, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.